This is ICASTnews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City, USA. And this is Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over. The United Nations is busy today, busy in the Security Council, busy in other individual meetings. It's part of what Marshall McLuhan might call a global village. But in this global village, we don't all speak the same language. So, from the inception of the United Nations in San Francisco, the end of the Second World War, what has the UN depended on? And what do world events depend on in our multilingual world? They depend on interpreters. An interpreter, a person who interprets, especially one who translates speech orally. Translate speech orally means you have to render into another language another culture's values, its nuances, its enthusiasm. It can get you in trouble, and if you don't get it right, it can get you, well, it can get you killed in some instances. We depend on interpreters. The UN once was the center of a movie about interpreters called The Interpreter, a thriller by Sidney Pollack, who convinced the then Secretary General of the United Nations to let them shoot in the UN for this film. But for the most part, these valuable people get forgotten, got left behind when the UN or an army moves out, and are vulnerable. Joining us to talk about this today is Linda Fitchett. Linda is from the International Association of Conference Interpreters, and she's been here. The UN's been paying a lot of attention to its history of interpretation, which began in San Francisco and got a lot of attention in the world at the Nuremberg trials, and is now finally beginning to try and to do something to protect and stand up for these valuable individuals. Linda, welcome.
Thank you.
Too often in the United States, being a mostly monolingual culture, we don't especially appreciate how difficult, how trying it is, and how much skill it takes to go from one culture, one society, one way of understanding something and rendering it in another. What do you think the key to being a good interpreter is?
Well, I think the key to being a good interpreter is never to lose your curiosity, to always be interested in very many things, because here at the UN, obviously, most of our interpreters are working in diplomatic fields to do with international politics, international diplomacy. But there are also many interpreters who work in very different fields, for medical conferences, for legal conferences, for technical conferences. I myself used to work in the European Union, and there we have a lot of legislation about very many different things, so it's rather like working maybe in your Congress, except we have a European Parliament that deals with all kinds of things. So you have to be very versatile. You have to, of course, be very good in your languages. You have to be able, most particularly, to understand the language that you're working from, and you have to be pretty articulate in the language that you're working into, which is usually your mother tongue.
And these days, I know at my university, there's a fight. People say, oh, you don't need to teach languages anymore. You can get Google Translator. But that doesn't much work, does it?
No.
No, that's kind of a recipe for a real disaster.
Google Translate is very useful if you're sitting at a computer at home and you can't think of a word and you look it up quickly. But if you've got to make a really nice speech and you've got to make proper sentences, Google Translator is not going to help you.
No, it's not going to help you. And I sometimes use Google Translator while I'm reading Balzac in French.
Right.
And I look up and then I say, you know, that probably is not the right
Probably
word.
not.
The right word. Wherever journalists go, they depend on local resources. People who not only speak a local language, but are immersed in a local culture, be it, a little country that has a language like Lithuanian or Finnish that few people know, or who speak the local version of Arabic. The United States has had lots of interpreters helping them over in Afghanistan. We've been in Afghanistan for 14 years. For some reason, they don't train all the American soldiers how to speak Arabic, which, in my opinion, is really, really, really stupid. But we leave a lot of them behind. Some of them want to stay behind because with English, they've got to step up in making money or starting a business. They also have a step up on the hit list from the Taliban. And this is a very sore point, especially now as a more nationalistic United States doesn't want to bring too many people from Muslim countries back in. What's the UN do to protect its translators, the people who interpret for them, the people who translate documents, the people who will go to some hellhole, let's say the backwoods of Haiti, for the UN, and then their lives are threatened? What does the UN do? Does it make good efforts to protect these folks?
Well, these are two very different things. Okay, so the interpreters you were talking about that were used by the US troops, say in Afghanistan, are all civilians, not necessarily trained interpreters. They're usually not interpreters at all, and they learn a lot on the job. And they are local interpreters, or if it's for journalists, they call them fixers, and they very often have a lot of local knowledge. They can act as a kind of a guide for the journalist. The interpreters, and they are the ones who are being left behind now in Iraq and Afghanistan. The ones that work for the UN are of course all trained professional interpreters. They may be staff interpreters, or they may be freelance interpreters. The UN has an agreement with AIC, our association, which agrees on things like working conditions, working times, but we don't really have an agreement on things like insurance, that kind of thing. But of course, if you're working for the UN, you're generally covered by the UN's general insurance scheme. So if the interpreters who are hired by the UN or who are staff at the UN go off to rather difficult places where something might happen, obviously everything is done to try to protect them, and there is some kind of an insurance that will presumably help them if anything happens. But the same is obviously not true of those who are working out as local, untrained, non-professional interpreters in war zones. They're two very different things.
I'll tell you, my own preference, having gone to a lot of hellholes, places with a 5 and 6 cockroach rating, I always like to go to local university and find people who are students of linguistics or of a second language, who are either getting a master's or sometimes a PhD, because I find that the combination of having grown up in a place and having taken language and linguistics study seriously gives them a real start, and sometimes it's given people real careers. What about general UN regulations and resolutions about the protection and the status of people who both interpret and translate? And we should make clear to our audience that translation usually involves the written word as opposed to oral, and sometimes oral is, you've got to make it work as you're going along. It's a test every 10 seconds.
It is indeed. It is indeed. We have to be very quick on our tongue, if not quick on our feet. So when we're working, obviously a translator who is doing a written translation will have time to use a dictionary if necessary, to perfect a very beautiful sentence if that's what they're looking for in a more literary text. But an interpreter, the oral translator, it has to come very, very quickly. And we have to sometimes make up for a little mental gap by a little acrobatics in order to get the real meaning. I mean, we're not so much the exact word, although we try to find an exact word, but what we want is an accurate meaning of the message that's being passed on. The spirit of the message as well. Yeah. Now, of course, if you go to somewhere and you're looking for people in universities or whatever, these will not be trained interpreters. There will probably be people who have very good knowledge, obviously, of their own language and maybe of another language, but they won't be trained interpreters or translators. So it's not quite the same thing. We most particularly in our association insist on the ethical question of being an interpreter, being impartial in the work that we do. We work for both sides of a discussion equally, whatever our opinions may be. We don't let our opinions show, we don't intervene, whereas an untrained interpreter may not know about that kind of thing, may try to intervene, may try to change the message. And we also believe in confidentiality, so that whatever we are told is never repeated outside the discussion, and especially if there's any secrecy involved. You will never hear anything from an interpreter, a professional interpreter, about what has been said during a discussion.
Are you protected under law, let's say British or American law? Do you have the equivalent of attorney-client or priest-confessor confidentiality?
Not really. Our own association has strict rules about confidentiality. It's one of our requirements for joining our association, but we do not figure in any international text. So when you were saying earlier, you know, what has the UN done to protect interpreters? Basically nothing. We fall through most of the gaps in international law, in international humanitarian law. We are considered like any civilian. So if you're in a conflict area, you have no more rights than any civilian. And the UN, for example, has adopted texts to protect journalists. We know that the journalists are still not entirely protected. They're still being shot and kidnapped. But there is no international text which actually gives us any more rights or any more protection than any other civilian.
So are you working on this with the UN? Is there a UN resolution underway?
We hope there will be. This is kind of the beginning. We have drafted actually a text. We have formed an international coalition of 6 organizations. 5 are language associations and 1 is an NGO based here in New York, which specializes in trying to protect translators and interpreters internationally. And we have, with some lawyers pro bono, have written a resolution which we will hope one of the UN members will take into the UN for us and get a text adopted, we hope, in the Security Council, which will be somewhat like the texts that have been adopted in the past for journalists, to give us at least a name in international legislation and some form of protection.
Do you have a long line of people volunteering to introduce this from
we don't, not yet, although we did speak yesterday evening. You know, there was an event in the UN to look back at our profession and the first interpreters who worked at the Nuremberg trials.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And during that event we did speak to some of the ambassadors and their representatives there, and we hope that some of them will indeed show an interest and help us to get a resolution into the UN.
I have a couple ideas for you.
Good, I'd be very pleased.
Unfortunately, I can't say that I think the Americans would do it, because I don't know if our new ambassador actually speaks second language. She may have at home because she was
possibly at home. She was, yes.
Yes, but I think there are people who are very sensitive to this issue, because some of them have had language training and linguistics in their backgrounds. I know from interviewing a number of foreign ministers here that they care deeply about this.
I know that Nikki Haley actually, in her hearing before she actually became ambassador here, did mention in her hearing that her husband had been in the military, I believe, and had worked with interpreters, and she thought that this was a very worthy cause, that the interpreters should be protected. So we do hope that at least at some point we'll be able to approach her and maybe gain her support.
She's a pretty open-minded person. It's just America is so monolingual. The whole world speaks English. You know, I have colleagues who are tenured professors who come over to my house for dinner and say, "Oh, I knew you spoke Russian, but why do you have these French books here?"
Yes, but it's not just because you're a monolingual country that you're not going to protect the interpreters who have helped you, or at least your military, in, say, Iraq and Afghanistan. And Britain also is a terribly monolingual country and also believes that everybody should speak English. So they need the interpreters, they need help when they go off on missions like this, and I think that therefore they perhaps morally ought to show their thanks to these people by protecting them, because at the moment they're in great danger.
You would think so, you know, and you would think, if you look at those films from the San Francisco conference in '45 and the people speaking the 5 UN languages, that the light bulb would have gone off, but it really doesn't. It's a blind spot. It's a blind spot. Maybe you need to work on how you say blind spot in 5 different languages and do a campaign based on that, because it really is something that you think should have been addressed much earlier.
I think possibly it's a question of the numbers of local linguists that were used in these wars that is something new. I don't think in any previous war there has been such recruitment of local linguistic help. And so I'm not sure that either the governments or indeed the military were quite prepared for this. The US, we believe, probably recruited about 5,500 local linguists, which you can't find necessarily in the universities or anywhere else in Iraq, for example. And I think the sheer numbers, first of all, have been a bit of a surprise and a bit of a problem for the governments to come to terms with. But I think my own personal vision is that maybe the governments are a little worried about creating a precedent for the future, that if they bring all of the interpreters who are asking for visas, the US Congress has just approved enough money for an extra 2,500 visas for the Afghan interpreters. Takes them, yes.
To clear those people.
And there is,
you would think it would be a lot easier.
Yeah, and there is still about 10,000 in the pipeline apparently. So the 2,500 are not probably going to be enough. And as you say, according to law in the States, it should take them 9 months to process the visas. In some cases, it's taking several years. And for some of the interpreters, there are added problems because they were recruited by contractors, defense contractors, who have now closed their books. So the files are not easily accessible. And they're having problems getting their papers. Some of them had some kind of a black mark against them. We know of one who had to go back to his family at a weekend and received a black mark because he had to go back to deal with family problems at a weekend, and was therefore away from base, had done nothing wrong, tried to get back to base, had difficulty getting back to base, and was given a black mark by the contractor. And these people may not get visas because they have these marks against them, and the government has refused to reopen the files. So there are problems.
You know, we all read Kafka, mostly in translation, but I think Franz Kafka would be able to describe this just perfectly. And it's too bad that we do live in this Kafkaesque world, but it's part of our modern world with our throwbacks to tribalism and non-understanding and cross-cultural miscommunication.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Those things imperil us all, those who report on things and those who do God's work, which is what you're doing, interpreting and trying to help us understand. And understanding is a good place to start.
Well, you know, in a globalized world, I think that international communication has become so much more important. We know that to a large extent English has become the vehicular language for all this global communication, but still, nevertheless, knowledge of another culture, another language, can be very helpful if you're trying to break down barriers between people and if you're trying to get a discussion going. You should not always expect the other person to be able to speak perfect English, and you have to also, I think, sometimes use people like us who can help you. I know the journalists very often, the foreign journalists need help from not necessarily the professionals who work at conference level, need the fixers who can give them contacts but can also help them linguistically. Without them, I don't think we'd have a lot of international free journalism. I mean, if a journalist doesn't understand the language, he can't report back.
No, and sometimes they misunderstand the culture even if they understand the language.
Yeah.
God help me, I've seen that. And here at the United Nations, it couldn't function. It simply could not function. You know, just today, and you did have both the South Korean and the Japanese ambassadors speaking English, but even then, I think a little nuance of their speech. They simplified it to make sure they got it right.
Yeah, well,
That
that's normal. In a foreign language, you say what you can, but in your own language, you can say anything you like, and you can express the nuances. It's the nuances that tend to get lost if you're having to speak a foreign language, and some people are not particularly gifted for languages.
We've had Secretary Generals of the UN who have had that problem, and it's inhibited their effective communication. But I think you're exactly right, and I hope that we get to hear more about interpreters, and we don't just see interpreters through that Sidney Pollack movie.
No, please not.
Interpreter.
This was not very true to life.
No, it certainly wasn't. But
No.
we all don't look like Nicole Kidman.
That's true. That's true.
She, they could cast anything in a movie. But I hope that you'll come back and soon tell us about your success in getting this resolution introduced.
I hope so.
Maybe next year during the General Assembly.
That would be wonderful. And if you can give us some help, we would be very pleased.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
A handshake is cultural.
It is cultural.
I don't think we need to interpret this, that we're very glad to have you here with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
For ICAStNews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City, USA, for Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over, which I won't translate. I'm Jonathan Sanders.